Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Olimpia Pilch and I am the Chief Strategy Officer of the recently formed Critical Minerals Africa Group, and I wear a few other hats with the Critical Minerals Associations. So I'm joined today by the lovely Frank Fannon, who is incredibly impressive. So Frank, I'll let you introduce yourself before we jump into the conversation.
Well, that's very kind of you. Great to be here again at Resourcing Tomorrow. I have my own advisory where I work with companies, advise companies in terms of the geopolitical issues and finding opportunity between that and the energy transition and national security. Prior to this role, I served as the inaugural U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, running energy diplomacy and elevated the role that critical minerals play as a part of America's foreign policy. I approached that job from industry, worked for a mining major in oil and gas, and then had other roles in energy world prior to that. So it's delightful to be here, and it's an interesting time for lots of reasons for this conference. I'm delighted to speak with you.
Absolutely, and what a day it has been today with headlines already, with the announced ban on exports of gallium, germanium, and antimony from China to the US. But before we jump into the implications of the domestic market in the US, what comes next under Trump 2.0 and the international implications, I think it would be great for you to give us a little bit of an overview what the difference between the Biden and the Trump administration has been.
Yeah, well, it's interesting reading the media headlines and this kind of concept that, well, whether President Trump will continue President Biden's focus on critical minerals, and how soon they forgot that the first critical minerals list was actually issued under the first Trump administration, and actually created this issue of focus on from the lens of security of the supply chain. Of course, then COVID hit us and strained those supply chains. The war in Ukraine further pulled them apart, and the continued hostilities and a more aggressive China ensures those traditional supply chains will remain in terminal decline, as evidenced by today's media announcements in our country by the CCP's actions. But in terms of framing, every government approaches their role, and they adopt an organizing principle of government as kind of the North Star, which will then inform the decision-making process, and particularly in matters of foreign policy. In the first Trump administration, that organizing principle was security. And as the world's lone superpower, it was able to provide a degree of influence in that context of security. By contrast, the Biden organizing principle at the outset was climate change. And in order for America to achieve its objectives, which was to mitigate climate change, it actually required more reliance with China, not less, given that they are the dominant manufacturing powerhouse of clean technologies, as well as the control of that critical mineral supply chain. Of course, the Biden administration was tested with actual wars, and so that was strained. But they also had some kind of muddled responses because they tried to do both. So now we have the Trump administration coming back. It's a renewed Trump administration, but in terms of that organizing principle, and the president's been very clear on this, it will be back to security. And focused in a direct way, what is the threats to security, and what are the tools and the instruments of government in collaboration with partners and allies that can have a meaningful countermeasure to improve the security situation in the United States.
Absolutely, and we've seen President-elect Trump already threatening some tariffs against China. That was in relation to the BRICS currency fiasco that we're seeing. But do you think that tariffs will be effective, and how the tariffs might shape up within the US market?
Well, it depends on how one describes effectiveness. What is the goal that's being sought here? This question of tariffs. So President Reagan, he famously said, if you want more of something, subsidize it. If you want less of it, tax it. The approach thus far has been to create more subsidies and create an incentivize certain preferred technologies, clean technologies through the Inflation Reduction Act and other provisions. What we haven't seen is the corresponding tariffs. So we've only been developing a race against China, a subsidy race. And that's a race that the US, as well as any free market economy, is destined to lose. So the construct of tariffs, I think, is in partnership with other incentives, is both sides of that coin. And so to do it in a collaborative way, I think it can absolutely have a positive impact. What is that impact? Back to what is the question we're seeking to solve for? I would say it's to improve the security situation of the United States. And speaking, that goes to the industrial base, including the development of clean energy technologies, but also things like the defense systems that are required, that use some of these key and niche critical metals.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, obviously you've mentioned security versus clean energy and the energy transition. Now, if you have been following the news headlines in the UK and Europe, it has been very much announced as climate Armageddon, with Trump 2.0 coming into power. What do you think will happen domestically? Obviously, there is as you mentioned, a security focus, but do you see, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act being defunded, significant changes for the critical minerals industry, especially through a lens of we have seen how policy is shaped in the Western world. If the US does something, the rest of the world, whether it's EU, UK, or Australia, panic and try to follow. So do you anticipate any major changes on the domestic front?
Yeah, well, the climate Armageddon narrative versus what countries are actually doing, there's this remarkable disconnect that's taking place. And I'm more interested in what companies are doing versus what the politicians may be saying they intend to do. In terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, look, the Inflation Reduction Act was a piece of legislation that was highly partisan. Not one Republican either chamber of Congress voted for it. Then Vice President Kamala Harris, still the Vice President, she was very proud on the campaign stump to say that she passed the deciding vote in the Senate as her role as the President of the Senate, to win and to move forward, because it was a budget reconciliation maneuver to get only 51 votes. So it passed. So the fact that Republicans, President Trump won both chambers of Congress and has won the popular vote, the first president in over 20 years to do so, that they would want to look at the partisan Inflation Reduction Act, I think that's not only expected, but they would have a responsibility to the constituency, most of Americans, to do so. Now, what does that mean in practice? I think that you're going to see some areas that are permissive on China. Those will be tightened. So in the context of electric vehicle credits and what is the credit worth? If it comes from China, then it should not benefit from US taxpayer subsidies. Well, the Biden administration noted, back to this competing interests of security versus climate change, they said up to 25% can be Chinese content. I think provisions like that, permissive provisions like that, which sends a mixed signal to the investment community, I think those were likely to be scrapped.
Is there an aspect of reality versus kind of political ideology? Of course, in an ideal world, we would prefer not to allow Chinese products into the market to undermine and use taxpayers' dollars. However, because these value chains are so underdeveloped, we're still in the process of building the processing, the refining in the Western world and in the US. Mm-hmm. What is the likely impact of that on the industry?
Look, the Inflation Reduction Act, unlike what the Chinese just announced on some other metals, restricting, there is not a prohibition against Chinese content coming into the U.S. The question before us is whether the U.S. taxpayer will subsidize an adversarial power content from coming in. It's not that we're preventing it from entering the market. It's just we're not going to subsidize it. I think that the American people, they don't want to subsidize that. And again, I think, but there's also real jobs are being created in part because of some of the new manufacturing that's occurring. So what is the composition of the future of the Inflation Reduction Act? I mean, other people have also commented that they expect it will be changed, as I do also agree, but it's whether it will be with a scalpel, versus a hatchet. I would tend to go more of the scalpel approach. But we have to isolate what is it we're seeking to solve for, and I think that's been muddled. I think in terms of, President Trump has been very clear, President-elect Trump, about creating jobs in the United States. So is someone doing that here, or are they seeking to do that elsewhere and use other backdoors to launder content in to the U.S. market and undermine the investment thesis for investment in the United States and investment in Europe and elsewhere?
Absolutely. And I'm sure that's music to taxpayers' ears, that their money will not be misused, fingers crossed. But focusing on the upstream, of course, the US has huge potential when it comes to mining, but many, many challenges in terms of permitting, getting stuck in litigation, etc. Do you think that's something that Trump 2.0 is willing to tackle?
Yeah, in the kind of waning years of the Trump 1.0, there was some work done on that, but again, COVID kind of froze that work. I think that that's absolutely something that is critical that we deal with, whether it's for the mine, or it's for clean energy, or it's for transmission lines. You need to be able to build stuff again. And how that's tackled, I think that's a bipartisan issue. It's how does one tackle it? How do we address it? What does reform look like? And how can it be? 4 years is a very short window of time to do these very long-term challenges. So it'll be an execution issue and an issue of prioritization. Where can they have an impact? Now, there's considerable flexibility in the executive branch. The challenge is mines take a long time. And the mine will be there during the Trump administration and then whoever comes after. And the pendulum swings that we're seeing is unhelpful for capital formation and create a confidence to actually invest in certain jurisdictions, including the United States. The U.S. isn't alone in this, of course, but you are also seeing a global shift in where capital is welcomed. Mm-hmm. I would also say that, Elon Musk decided to move Tesla from California to Texas years before the Inflation Reduction Act. He did it because Texas represented a place where you can build things. Capital is welcomed. Where is that happening? And famously, the media likes to report that the most of the battery belt, as it's called in America, are in red states or in Republican-leading states. Again, that IRA money can go anywhere. It's federal. But business is choosing to go where they can actually build stuff. So you're going to see you're going to see this shifting, and I think that that's going to be kind of the approach everywhere. Is where can you actually build stuff, and it will be built.
And can we expect to see more of a business-friendly approach to some of President Trump's future policies, rather than it being government-led? And we've had a bit of a discussion beforehand about some policies being slightly misguided, and we need more of a stronger industry involvement, especially when it comes to investment and capital allocation.
Yeah, I mean, look, in our system, the government can establish parameters for action, but it doesn't actually do anything. Say for waging war, it's the private sector that actually is the instrument of development and building. It's not the government. So can we create the appropriate level of signals to market participants that they can go off and develop new technologies, new methods, and develop mines and transmission and logistics and all of those other elements. And this is not just an academic exercise. This is what happened in the United States in the case of hydraulic fracturing. In 2005, Congress, under bipartisan majorities, something like 87 senators joined together and said, Congress is going to restrict the U.S. federal government from regulating hydraulic fracturing. It was a deregulatory action, and 3 years later, the shale revolution was born, and it changed the world. So can we incentivize, can government create the structure to allow the private sector to get after it? And that's what I do expect that you will see more of an inclination to do that in the Trump 2.0 administration. Some people deride it for having too many people from business. I think having business people in government who want to promote economic development is actually a virtue.
Definitely. And we need to have that fresh thinking, especially with some of the announcements around Elon Musk's role around efficiency. So perhaps that will help with some of the permitting reforms. I do want to touch on one last topic around the international impacts. Of course, critical minerals value chains are global, despite being dominated by China. There is some efforts have been made around the Mineral Security Partnership, around all these other bodies. There have been various MOUs with countries to cooperate. How do you see that proceeding under Trump 2.0? Do you think it's going to be a very much friendly hand-holding kind of situation, or we're going to see more, this is the US, we're doing this for our interests, let's cut a few deals, but it's less on the development side and more on this is what we need for security?
Well, I think that there's a clear recognition of that the U.S., even though we might have and do have an amazing minerals endowment, it's the time horizon that's necessary to develop them. And that means, again, with security being the North Star, it's going to require investment overseas and partnerships overseas. Firstly, I'd like to say, it's very difficult to create multinational fora and agreements. It is painstaking work, and it takes far too long than it should. Having done it myself, I have some sympathy for things like the Mineral Security Partnership. But under my time in government, we did create those institutions, those entities, which created a foundation for some of the programs that the Biden administration did. But it was focused on mobilizing capital formation. And so I would suspect that you're going to see a bit of a different approach, which will have the convenings of government, which is important because, again, establish those parameters. But there's going to be a focus on action and deployment of capital. More convenings and more conferences don't move tons. And so I think that there's going to be a very clear KPI indexed to what is the purpose of this event or this institution, this forum. These are important, these are critical steps on the journey, but we have to have the clarity of the goal in mind, and having the meeting is not the outcome. Moving the tons and the investment is the outcome. So I think that you will see a degree of continuity on some of the international fora and some of the partnerships, but it's going to have with clearly articulable objectives in terms of development.
Definitely. And we've all attended so many of these conferences, so many of these government roundtables, workshops, but the action has very much been missing. And what we're seeing in the markets at the moment with prices being less than attractive, trying to get the capital to flow into these projects has been incredibly difficult. Can you see the Trump 2.0 administration somehow trying to solve those issues around pricing specifically?
Well, I think depending on how we talked about tariffs, that's one of the ways to do so, right? You make something that's inexpensive more so. And why do you do that? Because there's an unlevel playing field in the way in which it's being produced. I think that, and there's various ways how you can talk about internalizing those costs, whether it's issues, and there's also precedence with the United States Congress focusing on Chinese content that was produced in Xinjiang. There was something called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which created a presumption that if something is produced in that province, that it was tainted by forced or child labor. And that shifted the presumption and it required the producers in that area to demonstrate that they're not. It shifts the presumption. I think that this is also something that is one of those externalities that we will see, and I think that for free countries, we don't want to see the taint of human rights abuse and environmental harm that feed into a clean energy future. I think that's anachronistic to those goals. So how do we create a degree of transparency in that? The Department of Labor in September released a report which got absolutely zero media attention, concerned forced and child labor, and it exposed a lot of these issues and how what's happening. So I think we have work to do there.
Absolutely. There's a huge challenge ahead of us, and I can see Andrew pacing nervously. So one final question.
Please.
Can we expect to see you under the Trump 2.0 administration?
What was that?
Can we expect to see you involved in the Trump 2.0 administration?
I'm very pleased to sit here on this stage and speak to all of you good people. Hope to do so again next year. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent answer. Thank you everyone so much.